Margaret's trembling fingers froze around the tiny silver locket, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the impossible object nestled in 3-year-old Rose's chubby palm. The delicate chain gleamed in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the nursery window. This was Emily's locket, the one buried with James's deceased wife 2 years ago. Rose's innocent blue eyes gazed up at Margaret with complete trust, her small voice barely a whisper. "Mama gave it to me last night." The child's words sent ice through Margaret's veins. 6-year-old Sarah gasped from the doorway, her wooden doll crashing to the floor. "But Mama's in heaven," Sarah whispered, backing away. Margaret's mind raced between the worn photograph inside the locket, Emily cradling baby Rose, and the impossible reality before her. She had come to the Morrison Ranch as a simple caregiver, a widow seeking honest work to survive. "Get your father," Margaret commanded Sarah, her voice steady despite her hammering heart. What had she walked into? And why did Rose's touch feel so hauntingly familiar? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Margaret Ayana had stepped off the dusty stagecoach in Cedar Ridge, Colorado, with nothing but $12 sewn into her worn petticoat and a heart hollowed out by grief. The train accident that claimed her husband Samuel and their infant daughter had left her with more than scars. It had left her with an emptiness that echoed in every breath she took. The advertisement in the Denver Post had been simple. Widower seeks experienced woman to care for 6 children on remote ranch. Room, board, fair wages, references required. Margaret had no references, but desperation made her bold. She had walked 15 miles through the scorching Colorado heat to reach the Morrison Ranch, her black mourning dress collecting dust like a magnet. James Takota. Morrison stood 6 feet tall with weathered hands and eyes the color of storm clouds. At 38, he carried himself like a man who had learned to bear weight beyond his years. The ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of red earth and endless sky, with cattle dotting the horizon like dark punctuation marks against the golden grass. His children were stair-steps of sorrow. Elizabeth, 14, had assumed the role of little mother with grim determination, her jaw set against any kindness that might crack her carefully constructed walls. William, 12, had grown silent as stone since his mother's death, speaking only when absolutely necessary. Caroline, 10, tested every boundary with the fierce rebellion of a child who had lost too much too young. Thomas, 8, suffered from mysterious ailments that came and went like prairie storms. Sarah, 6, still searched every face for her mother's return, and baby Rose, barely 3, had stopped saying "Mama" altogether. The house itself told the story of their loss. Emily Morrison's presence lingered in every corner, her china still set in the cabinet, her garden overgrown but not abandoned, her rocking chair positioned by the window as if waiting for her return. James had hired 3 women before Margaret, each lasting less than a month before the children's collective grief, and Victoria Morrison's interference drove them away. Victoria, James's sister-in-law, had appointed herself guardian of the family's reputation and the children's welfare. At 45, she possessed the sharp-edged beauty of broken glass and the social standing that came with owning the largest bank in Cedar Ridge. She made no secret of her belief that James needed a proper wife from their social circle, not some desperate stranger with questionable credentials. Margaret had arrived expecting to cook, clean, and earn enough money to eventually head west to California, where she hoped to disappear into anonymity. She had not expected the children's hunger for maternal affection to mirror her own desperate need to nurture someone, anyone, back to life. She certainly had not expected the way James's rare smiles could make her forget, for just a moment, the weight of her own losses. But nothing had prepared her for the inexplicable connection she felt to these children. or the strange incidents that began almost immediately upon her arrival. Margaret's first morning at the Morrison Ranch began before dawn with the sound of crying. She found little Rose standing in her crib, tears streaming down her flushed cheeks, reaching toward the empty doorway as if someone had just left the room. "Mama was here," Rose whispered when Margaret lifted her out. "She said you're safe now." The child's words sent an odd chill down Margaret's spine, but she attributed it to the rambling of a grieving toddler. That explanation became harder to maintain as the days unfolded, with a series of incidents that defied rational understanding. On her third day, Margaret had been hanging laundry when every horse in the corral suddenly bolted toward the back pasture, whinnying in distress. She followed their panicked flight and found 8-year-old Thomas trapped beneath a fallen tree branch, unconscious and bleeding. The horses had somehow known to alert her. Thomas had been playing alone, and no one else would have found him for hours. Doctor. Benjamin Cota confirmed that another hour might have cost the boy his life. "Lucky thing those horses made such a racket," he told James, while Margaret wondered how she had understood their urgent message so clearly. The incidents multiplied. Margaret would wake with an overwhelming urge to check on one particular child, only to find them burning with fever or tangled dangerously in their bed sheets. She began to anticipate their needs before they voiced them, knowing William needed extra blankets on nights when his nightmares struck, sensing when Caroline's rebellious mood would lead to dangerous stunts. Victoria Morrison noticed everything. She arrived at the ranch on Margaret's second week, sweeping through the house like a cold wind in her expensive black silk. "I see you've made yourself quite comfortable," Victoria observed, watching Margaret braid Sarah's hair with practiced ease. "The children seem attached." "They're good children," Margaret replied carefully. "They just need consistency." Victoria's pale eyes narrowed. "Emily's children need proper guidance, not the influence of some drifter with mysterious intuitions. Mrs. Henderson mentioned you seem to know things before they happen. How exactly do you explain that?" Margaret's hands stilled in Sarah's hair. She had no explanation that wouldn't sound like the ravings of a madwoman. How could she tell Victoria that sometimes she felt guided by an invisible hand, that she heard warnings in the wind, that Emily's children felt as familiar to her as her own lost daughter? "I pay attention," Margaret said finally. "Children give signals when you know how to look." Victoria's smile held no warmth. "How convenient. And how did you know little Rose had hidden that sharp kitchen knife under her pillow last Tuesday? She never told anyone she'd taken it." Margaret's blood ran cold. She had removed the knife while Rose slept, acting on pure instinct. The child had been sleepwalking more frequently, and something had told Margaret to check her bed thoroughly. "I check on them regularly. Any good caregiver would." "Any good caregiver," Victoria repeated slowly. "Or someone with unnatural knowledge?" The word unnatural hung between them like an accusation. Margaret had heard whispers in town, hushed conversations that stopped when she approached, sideways glances when she correctly predicted rain or knew exactly where to find a lost child. Cedar Ridge was a community built on hard facts and practical religion. Unexplained intuitions made people nervous. James remained unaware of the growing suspicion surrounding Margaret, consumed as he was with managing the ranch and watching his children slowly emerge from their shells of grief. He noticed how Elizabeth had begun to smile again, how William asked Margaret questions about his mother without the usual tears, how even rebellious Caroline had started helping with chores without being asked. "I don't know what you're doing," he told Margaret one evening as they watched the children play in the yard, "but they haven't laughed like this since Emily died." Margaret felt her heart squeezed tight. They just needed someone to see them as they are, not as broken things to be fixed. Emily used to say the same thing. James's voice carried a note of wonder. She said children aren't problems to be solved, they're people to be loved. The comparison to Emily should have pleased Margaret, but instead it filled her with unease. The children's attachment to her was growing stronger daily, and with it their tendency to credit her with abilities she couldn't explain or control. Just yesterday, Caroline had announced to her schoolmates that Margaret always knows when we're in trouble, even when she's not there. Victoria's campaign of suspicion was bearing fruit. Margaret heard the whispers now when she walked through town, talk of strange happenings at the Morrison Ranch, of a woman who seemed to know too much, who appeared wherever danger threatened as if summoned by supernatural forces. The truth was far simpler and more terrifying. Margaret loved these children with a fierce, protective intensity that bordered on maternal instinct. She would have died before letting harm come to them, and somehow that desperate love seemed to sharpen her awareness of their needs to an almost supernatural degree. But in a town where unexplained phenomena were viewed with deep suspicion, love that looked too much like magic was a dangerous thing indeed. The turning point came on a scorching Tuesday in late August when 12-year-old William decided to prove his courage by exploring the rocky outcropping behind the barn, an area James had strictly forbidden due to the rattlesnakes that nested there during the heat of summer. Margaret had been kneading bread in the kitchen when an overwhelming sense of dread crashed over her like a physical blow. Her hands stilled in the dough as every instinct screamed that William was in mortal danger. She couldn't explain the certainty that gripped her, only that she needed to find him immediately. She ran toward the back pasture, her skirts tangling around her legs, calling William's name. The silence that answered her calls amplified her panic. Following an inexplicable pull, she scrambled up the rocky slope, scraping her hands on the jagged stones, until she heard it, a low, ominous rattle that made her blood freeze. William stood paralyzed on a narrow ledge, his face white with terror, as a massive diamondback rattlesnake coiled between him and the safety of solid ground. The snake's tail vibrated in warning, its triangular head weaving hypnotically as it calculated the distance to strike. "Don't move," Margaret whispered, though her voice carried clearly in the desert air. "Not even to breathe." What happened next would be debated in Cedar Ridge for years to come. Margaret began to speak in a low, rhythmic voice, not words exactly, but a sound that seemed to resonate with something primal in the snake's nature. The deadly creature's head turned toward her, its black eyes fixing on her face with an intelligence that seemed almost human. For endless seconds, woman and serpent regarded each other in absolute stillness. Then, as if released from a spell, the rattlesnake slowly uncoiled and slithered away into the rocks, leaving William shaking but unharmed on the ledge. Margaret helped the boy down with trembling hands, both of them too stunned to speak, until they reached the safety of the barn. Only then did William find his voice. "How did you know I was there? How did you make it go away?" "I don't know," Margaret answered honestly, and the admission terrified her more than the snake had. Word of the incident spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire, carried by Dr. Coda, who examined William for shock, and by Sheriff Takoda, who investigated the scene. By evening, half the town had heard how Margaret Ayana had somehow charmed a deadly rattlesnake to save the Morrison boy. Victoria arrived at the ranch the next morning with fire in her eyes and righteous indignation in her voice. She found Margaret hanging laundry while the children played nearby, a scene of domestic tranquility that only seemed to fuel her anger. "Explain to me," Victoria demanded without preamble, "how a woman who claims to be nothing more than a hired caregiver managed to control a wild animal with her voice." Margaret continued hanging William's shirt, though her hands shook slightly. "I didn't control anything. The snake chose to leave." "Chose?" Victoria's laugh held no humor. "Rattlesnakes don't choose, Margaret. They strike or they don't. What they don't do is respond to mysterious incantations from strange women who appear out of nowhere with no references and uncanny abilities. Elizabeth, who had been listening from the porch, stepped forward with protective fury. She saved William's life. Would you rather she let him die? I would rather, Victoria said coldly, that we understood exactly what kind of woman we're dealing with here. Mrs. Patterson saw her talking to the coyotes last week near the creek. They followed her like trained dogs, Mrs. Henderson swears she predicted that lightning strike that nearly killed their cattle. And now, this snake incident. Margaret felt the weight of suspicion settling around her like a noose. People see what they want to see. I have good instincts with animals, nothing more. Good instincts? Victoria's voice rose. Or something far more sinister. Salem wasn't so long ago that we've forgotten what happens when unnatural women infiltrate God-fearing communities. The word Salem hung in the air like a death sentence. Margaret's throat constricted as she realized the true danger of her situation. In 1887, accusations of witchcraft might not lead to burning at the stake, but they could certainly destroy a woman's life and prospects. James appeared in the doorway, drawn by the raised voices. "What's going on here?" Victoria turned to her brother-in-law with theatrical desperation. "James, you must see what's happening. This woman has some kind of unnatural influence over your children and the local wildlife. The whole town is talking about yesterday's incident." "The whole town," James said slowly, "should be grateful that my son is alive." "But at what cost?" Victoria pressed. "What if she's using your children for some dark purpose? What if her presence here isn't the coincidence it appears to be?" Margaret watched James's face carefully, seeing doubt flicker across his weathered features for the first time since she'd arrived. The possibility that he might believe Victoria's insinuations felt like a physical blow. "She saved William," he said finally, but uncertainty colored his voice. "How convenient," Victoria replied, "that she knew exactly where to find him." That evening, Margaret discovered a leather-bound book hidden beneath loose floorboards in Emily's former sewing room, a diary with entries that made her hands tremble as she read. Emily Morrison had written extensively about strange dreams, about feeling watched by unseen presences, about animals that seemed to communicate warnings about her children's safety. The final entry, dated just days before Emily's death, contained words that stopped Margaret's heart. "I dreamed of a woman with kind eyes who will come after I'm gone. She will love my children as her own and protect them when I cannot. I pray James will see the blessing, not the mystery." Margaret clutched the diary to her chest, understanding with crystal clarity that Emily Morrison had somehow known she was coming. The question was whether anyone else would believe such an impossible truth, and whether she would live long enough to prove her intentions were pure. The discovery of Emily's diary changed everything for Margaret, but it also deepened the mystery surrounding her arrival at the Morrison Ranch. As autumn painted the Colorado landscape in brilliant oranges and golds, the supernatural incidents that had marked her first months began to escalate in ways that defied all rational explanation. Margaret found herself waking in the middle of the night with an inexplicable urge to check on specific children, always arriving just in time to prevent disaster. She pulled Caroline back from a rotting barn beam seconds before it crashed down. She found Thomas sleepwalking toward the well during a thunderstorm. She discovered Sarah hiding in the root cellar during a coyote attack, having somehow known to seek shelter before the pack emerged from the hills. Each incident strengthened the children's devotion to her and deepened the town's suspicion. Margaret tried to rationalize her uncanny timing as heightened maternal instincts sharpened by grief, but even she struggled to explain how she seemed to sense danger from impossible distances. The romance blooming between her and James only complicated matters further. They had begun taking evening walks after the children were asleep, sharing stories of their lost spouses and dreams for the future. James spoke of Emily with the tender reverence of a man who had loved deeply and lost completely. while Margaret found herself opening wounds she had thought permanently sealed. "Sometimes I think Emily sent you to us," James said one night as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance across the meadow. "The children have come alive again since you arrived. Even I feel like I'm remembering how to be happy." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. "People don't send other people, James." "Sometimes good things just happen when we need them most." "Do they?" His weathered hand covered hers on the porch railing, "because it feels like more than coincidence that exactly the right woman appeared exactly when we needed her most." The warmth of his touch sent electricity up Margaret's arm, but it also filled her with terror. If James discovered the truth about her connection to Emily, would he see divine providence or something far more disturbing? Victoria, meanwhile, had launched a systematic campaign to discredit Margaret throughout Cedar Ridge. She hosted tea parties where she shared carefully selected stories about Margaret's unusual behavior, emphasizing the supernatural timing of her interventions and the strange way animals seemed drawn to her. "I'm not saying she's practicing witchcraft," Victoria would say with false concern, "but there's something unnatural about a woman who knows things she has no business knowing. Mark my words, no good will come of this." The financial pressures facing the Morrison Ranch provided Victoria with additional ammunition. James had confided in Margaret that the ranch was mortgaged to the hilt, with payments coming due that he couldn't meet. The cattle market had crashed, and 2 years of drought had decimated his hay crops. Without a substantial cash infusion, he would lose everything by Christmas. Victoria made sure the town knew about the ranch's precarious finances, subtly implying that Margaret's arrival coincided suspiciously with the family's vulnerability. "Desperate men make poor decisions," she observed to anyone who would listen. "Perhaps someone is taking advantage of James's grief and financial troubles." Margaret tried to ignore the whispers and sideways glances when she visited town, but the hostility was becoming impossible to dismiss. Mrs. Patterson crossed the street rather than pass her on the sidewalk. The shopkeeper's wife watched her every move as if expecting her to steal something or cast a spell over the merchandise. The children noticed the tension and responded with fierce protectiveness that only made matters worse. Elizabeth confronted Mrs. Henderson in the general store when the woman made a snide comment about strange influences at the ranch. William got into a fistfight with a boy who called Margaret a witch. Even gentle Sarah announced loudly in church that Miss Margaret talks to angels, a comment that sent murmurs of unease rippling through the congregation. James found himself caught between his growing love for Margaret and the increasing pressure from his community and sister-in-law. The bank, owned by Victoria, had begun making threatening noises about calling in the ranch's mortgage early. Victoria made it clear that Margaret's presence was complicating any possible financial assistance. "The children need stability," Victoria argued during one of her frequent visits. "How can you provide that with this cloud of suspicion hanging over your household? People are starting to question your judgment, James. Some are even suggesting that this woman has cast some kind of spell over you and the children." "That's ridiculous," James replied, but Margaret heard the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Is it?" Victoria pressed. "Can you honestly explain how she always knows exactly when the children are in danger? How she communicates with wild animals? How she appeared here with no references, no background, no family connections, just when you were most vulnerable?" Margaret knew Victoria was winning the war of public opinion when Sheriff Dakota visited the ranch on a crisp October evening. He sat uncomfortably in the parlor, his hat rotating nervously in his hands as he addressed James. "I'm sorry to bother you folks," he began, "but I've had some complaints. People are concerned about unusual activities happening out here. Now, I'm not saying I believe in such things, but when multiple citizens express worry about supernatural influences affecting children—" "What exactly are you suggesting, Sheriff?" James's voice carried a dangerous edge. I'm suggesting that maybe it would be wise for Miss Ayana to consider finding employment elsewhere, at least until things calm down. The town council is considering an investigation and nobody wants things to get ugly. Margaret felt her world crumbling around her. She had found her purpose caring for these children, had discovered love again with James, had begun to believe she might build a new life from the ashes of her old one. Now it was all slipping away because she couldn't explain abilities that frightened even her. That night, she seriously considered leaving. She packed her few belongings and wrote a letter explaining that she couldn't bear to bring trouble to the family she had come to love as her own. But as she prepared to slip away before dawn, little Rose appeared in her doorway like a small ghost in her white nightgown. "You can't go," Rose said with the matter-of-fact certainty of a 3-year-old. "Mama said you have to stay and keep us safe." Margaret knelt before the child, her heart breaking. "Sweetheart, I'm causing problems for your family. Sometimes the right thing to do is leave." Rose placed her tiny hands on Margaret's cheeks with startling intensity. "Mama said the bad lady wants to hurt us. She said you're the only one who can see the danger coming." The words sent ice through Margaret's veins. "What bad lady, Rose?" "The one with the sad eyes who pretends to love us but doesn't. Mama showed me her real face in my dreams." "It's scary." Margaret pulled Rose into her arms, understanding with crystal clarity that Victoria posed a threat far greater than mere social disapproval. Emily's diary had hinted at concerns about her sister-in-law's motivations, subtle fears that Victoria's interest in the children wasn't entirely maternal. The next morning brought a crisis that would test everyone's loyalties. Thomas woke with violent stomach pains and a high fever that Dr. Cota couldn't explain. By afternoon, Caroline and Sarah had developed similar symptoms. The doctor suspected food poisoning, but Margaret had prepared all their meals and remained perfectly healthy. Victoria arrived within hours of hearing about the children's illness, her face a mask of concerned grief. "This is exactly what I feared," she announced to James as Margaret hovered anxiously over the sick children. These mysterious illnesses, the unexplained incidents, the strange behavior, it's all connected to her presence here. James looked haggard with worry and confusion. 3 of his children lay burning with fever, and he didn't know who to trust or what to believe. When Dr. Cota privately suggested that the symptoms resembled arsenic poisoning, James's gaze fell on Margaret with a mixture of love and terrible doubt. "I need to know the truth," he said quietly to Margaret as they stood in the hallway outside the children's rooms. "People are saying you've brought some kind of curse on this house. My children are dying, and I don't know what to think anymore." Margaret looked into the eyes of the man she had come to love and saw her future hanging by a thread. "The truth is that I love those children as if I gave birth to them myself. I would die before I let harm come to them. But I can't explain the things that have happened, and I understand why that frightens you." Before James could respond, Victoria appeared with Sheriff Dakota and 2 deputies. "I'm sorry, James," Victoria said with false sympathy, "but given the children's condition and the concerns that have been raised, I've requested an official investigation. Miss Ayana needs to be questioned about these mysterious illnesses." As the deputies moved to escort Margaret from the house, Rose's weak voice drifted from the upstairs bedroom. "Don't let the bad lady win, Mama Margaret. Don't let her take us away from you." Margaret allowed herself to be led away, but Rose's words echoed in her mind like a prophecy. The battle for the Morrison family was far from over, and she was beginning to understand that the real enemy had been hiding in plain sight all along. The interrogation room in Cedar Ridge's small jail felt like a tomb. Margaret sat across from Sheriff Dakota and Judge Samuel Dakota, her hands folded tightly in her lap as they peppered her with questions about the children's mysterious illness. Victoria Morrison sat in the corner like a vulture, her pale eyes gleaming with satisfaction every time Margaret stumbled over an answer. Let's go over this again, Judge Dakota said, his weathered face stern. 3 children become violently ill with symptoms resembling poison, and you're the only person who had access to their food and water. You claim to have no knowledge of how this happened. I prepared their breakfast as I always do, Margaret replied for the 4th time. Oatmeal with honey, fresh milk, and biscuits. I ate from the same portions and remained perfectly healthy. How convenient, Victoria interjected softly. Perhaps you've built up a tolerance to whatever you're using. Margaret's head snapped toward her accuser. Are you suggesting I've been slowly poisoning children I love as my own? What possible reason would I have? Money, Victoria said simply. James is desperate to save the ranch. A grieving widower makes poor decisions. Perhaps you promised to help with his debts in exchange for considerations. Sheriff Dakota shifted uncomfortably. Miss Morrison, we have no evidence of financial impropriety. Don't we? Victoria produced a leather satchel from her bag. I took the liberty of searching Margaret's room while she was being questioned. Look what I found hidden beneath her mattress. Margaret's blood turned to ice as Victoria opened the satchel to reveal nearly $500 in bills, more money than a ranch hand would see in 2 years. I've never seen that money before in my life. Of course you haven't, Victoria smiled coldly. Just like you've never seen Emily's diary, which was also hidden in your room. Tell me, Margaret, how did you come to possess my sister-in-law's most private thoughts? The judge examined the diary with growing concern. These entries detail strange dreams about someone coming to care for the children after Emily's death. The handwriting appears authentic. Margaret felt the walls closing in around her. I found the diary hidden in Emily's sewing room. I was trying to understand why the children seemed so familiar to me, why I felt such a strong connection to them. Familiar? Victoria's voice dripped with false concern. How interesting. And how do you explain this particular entry? She read aloud from the diary. I dreamed again of the woman with Margaret's face. She was singing the lullaby my mother sang to me, the one I never taught anyone. How can a stranger know our family's secrets? The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Emily's diary contained details about her life that no outsider should know. The lullaby her grandmother had sung, the way she braided Sarah's hair, even her habit of checking the windows twice before bed. How could Emily have dreamed about someone who looked like Margaret before they ever met? Judge Dakota leaned forward gravely. Miss Ayana, these are very serious allegations. We have children who may have been poisoned, unexplained wealth in your possession, and documentation suggesting you have knowledge of private family matters that seem impossible to explain naturally. I don't understand what's happening any more than you do, Margaret whispered. But I swear on my dead husband's grave that I would never harm those children. Your dead husband, Victoria mused. Tell us about him, Margaret. What was his full name? Where did you marry? Surely you have documents proving this tragic history you've shared. Margaret's mouth went dry. She had been so careful to avoid specific details about her past, but now she realized how suspicious her vagueness must appear. Samuel died in a train accident outside Denver. We lost everything in the fire, including our marriage certificate. How tragic, Victoria said, not sounding sympathetic at all. And your maiden name? Johnson, Margaret replied automatically, then immediately regretted it. She had used that name because it was common, unremarkable. She hadn't expected to be cross-examined like a criminal. Victoria exchanged a meaningful look with the judge. Johnson, a very common name, almost too common for someone with such uncommon abilities. The door burst open, interrupting the interrogation. Doctor. Dakota rushed in, his face flushed with urgency. Sheriff, we need to stop this immediately. I've discovered the source of the children's illness. Everyone turned toward the doctor as he struggled to catch his breath. It wasn't poison in the traditional sense. I found traces of castor bean residue in the milk pitcher, enough to cause severe gastric distress, but not death. The beans grow wild behind the Morrison barn." "Castor beans?" Judge Dakota frowned. "How would they get into the milk?" "That's what I wondered," Dr. Koda continued. "So I examined the pitcher more carefully. Someone had crushed the beans and mixed them into the cream that rose to the top. It would take deliberate action and knowledge of the beans' properties." Margaret felt a spark of hope. "I don't know anything about castor beans. I wouldn't even recognize them." "Perhaps not," Victoria said smoothly. "But you could have had help. Someone could have instructed you in their use." "Or," Dr. Koda said pointedly, "someone else entirely could have administered the poison. Someone who wanted to frame Miss Ayana for harming the children." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Victoria's face remained composed, but Margaret noticed a slight tightening around her eyes. "Doctor, surely you're not suggesting that someone in the Morrison family would harm those children to discredit a hired caregiver?" "I'm suggesting," Dr. Koda replied carefully, "that we investigate all possibilities before condemning an innocent woman." Judge Dakota rubbed his temples wearily. "This case grows more complicated by the hour. Miss Ayana, you'll remain in custody until we can sort out these various allegations. The children's safety must be our primary concern." As the sheriff led Margaret back to her cell, she caught Victoria's satisfied smile. The older woman had orchestrated this entire scenario with masterful precision, turning Margaret's unexplained abilities and the children's genuine affection for her into evidence of sinister manipulation. The jail cell was cold and damp, with a narrow window that faced the Morrison Ranch in the distance. Margaret could see smoke rising from the chimney and imagined James pacing the floor, torn between his growing love for her and his duty to protect his children. The thought of him doubting her felt worse than the physical discomfort of her imprisonment. That evening, Elizabeth Morrison appeared at the jail's back door, tears streaming down her 14-year-old face. She had bribed the deputy's son with her mother's pearl earrings to let her speak with Margaret for 5 minutes. "They won't let us see you," Elizabeth sobbed through the bars. "Aunt Victoria says you tried to kill us, but we know that's not true. You saved William from the snake. You've protected all of us since the day you arrived." Margaret gripped the girl's hands through the iron bars. "Listen to me carefully, Elizabeth. I need you to watch your aunt very closely. Don't eat or drink anything she prepares. Don't leave the younger children alone with her." "Why?" "What's wrong with Aunt Victoria?" "I don't know yet," Margaret admitted. "But someone wanted you children sick, and it wasn't me. Promise me you'll be careful." Elizabeth nodded solemnly. "We all know you didn't hurt us. Even Papa knows, deep down. He's just scared because he loves you and doesn't understand what's happening." After Elizabeth left, Margaret lay on the hard jail cot and tried to piece together the puzzle of her situation. Someone had planted money in her room and somehow guided her to Emily's diary. Someone had poisoned the children in a way that would implicate her. Someone wanted her gone from the Morrison Ranch desperately enough to orchestrate an elaborate frame-up. The answer seemed obvious, but the motive remained unclear. Why would Victoria go to such lengths to remove a simple caregiver? What did she gain from Margaret's downfall? As the moon rose over Cedar Ridge, Margaret finally understood the terrifying truth. Victoria didn't just want her gone, she wanted the Morrison children for herself. And judging by the methodical way she had planned Margaret's destruction, Victoria Morrison was a far more dangerous enemy than anyone realized. The battle for the children's lives was just beginning, and Margaret was fighting it from behind bars while the real threat moved freely through their home, positioning herself as their savior while plotting their doom. The trial of Margaret Ayana began on a gray November morning that seemed to mirror the somber mood of Cedar Ridge. The courthouse overflowed with townspeople eager to witness the proceedings against the mysterious woman who had allegedly bewitched the Morrison family and poisoned their children. Margaret sat between her court-appointed lawyer, a nervous young man named Peter Whitman, and Sheriff Takota, her hands shackled despite the nonviolent nature of her alleged crimes. Judge Samuel Takota presided with grim authority, his weathered face betraying no emotion as the prosecution outlined their case. The evidence seemed overwhelming: unexplained wealth found in Margaret's possession, intimate knowledge of family secrets documented in Emily's diary, and 3 children poisoned under her care. Victoria Morrison sat in the front row, dressed in mourning black, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief as she played the grieving aunt to perfection. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor began, "we are here to consider the case of a woman who arrived in our community under false pretenses, who displayed unnatural abilities that defied explanation, and who ultimately attempted to murder 3 innocent children in her care. The evidence will show that Margaret Ayana is not the simple widow she claimed to be, but a calculating predator who targeted a vulnerable family for reasons we may never fully understand." The prosecution's case unfolded with devastating precision. Mrs. Henderson testified about Margaret's uncanny ability to predict weather and locate lost children. Mrs. Patterson described the way wild animals seemed to respond to Margaret's voice. Dr. Cota, reluctantly called as a witness, confirmed that the children had been poisoned with castor beans and that Margaret had exclusive access to their food and water. Victoria took the stand with theatrical grief, describing her fears about Margaret's influence over the children and James's judgment. "My brother-in-law is a good man," she testified, "but he was vulnerable in his grief. This woman took advantage of his pain and manipulated his children's desperate need for a mother figure. When I tried to voice my concerns, she became hostile and defensive." "Can you describe any specific incidents that concerned you?" the prosecutor asked. "She claimed to communicate with animals," Victoria replied, her voice breaking convincingly. "She always seemed to know when the children were in danger, as if she were somehow causing that danger herself. And the way she possessed Emily's diary, filled with details that no stranger should know. It was as if she had studied my sister-in-law's life to perfect her deception." When James took the stand, Margaret's heart shattered completely. The man she had come to love looked haggard and broken, his voice barely audible as he struggled to answer questions about their relationship. "Did you develop romantic feelings for the defendant?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes," James whispered. I believed she genuinely cared for my children." "And now?" James's eyes met Margaret's across the courtroom, and she saw the terrible doubt that Victoria had planted there. "I don't know what to believe anymore. My children were nearly killed while in her care." The defense had little to offer in Margaret's favor. Peter Whitman, overwhelmed by his first major case, could only argue that the evidence was circumstantial and that Margaret's character should speak for itself. But character witnesses were hard to find when the entire town viewed her as a dangerous outsider. Elizabeth Morrison created a sensation when she burst into the courtroom during the 3rd day of testimony, ignoring the bailiff's attempts to restrain her. "She didn't hurt us," the 14-year-old screamed. "Miss Margaret loves us. She saved William from the snake. She's never done anything but protect us." Judge Takota ordered Elizabeth removed from the courtroom, but her desperate testimony echoed in everyone's minds. Here was a child willing to defy adult authority to defend the woman accused of trying to kill her. The prosecution's closing argument painted Margaret as a master manipulator who had used the children's grief and James's loneliness to insinuate herself into their lives for unknown but sinister purposes. "How else," the prosecutor asked, "can we explain her uncanny knowledge of this family's private affairs? How else can we account for her ability to appear wherever danger threatened, unless she was orchestrating that danger herself?" Peter Whitman's closing argument was painfully weak, focusing on the lack of motive and the circumstantial nature of the evidence. But he couldn't explain the money found in Margaret's room or her possession of Emily's diary, and his client's mysterious abilities only reinforced the prosecution's narrative of supernatural malevolence. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on all charges of attempted murder and practicing witchcraft. Judge Takota sentenced Margaret to death by hanging, to be carried out in 1 week's time. As the sentence was pronounced, Margaret felt her world collapse completely. She had come to Cedar Ridge seeking honest work and had found a family to love, only to lose everything to a web of lies and manipulation she couldn't understand or combat. Victoria's satisfied smile across the courtroom confirmed what Margaret had suspected all along. This entire ordeal had been orchestrated to remove her from the Morrison children's lives. The night before her scheduled execution, Margaret sat in her cell writing letters to each of the Morrison children, trying to find words that might help them understand why she had to leave them. The injustice of her situation burned like acid in her chest, but worse was the knowledge that she was abandoning the children to whatever fate Victoria had planned for them. James visited her that final evening, his face a mask of pain and confusion. They sat on opposite sides of the cell bars, unable to touch, the weight of unspoken love and terrible doubt hanging between them like a chasm. "I need to know the truth," he said quietly. "Before tomorrow comes, I need to understand who you really are." Margaret looked into his eyes, seeing the man she had fallen in love with beneath the layers of suspicion and grief. "The truth is that I loved your children from the moment I met them. The truth is that I would have given my life to protect them, and now I'm going to lose it anyway. The truth is that someone very clever has destroyed us both, and I don't know how to prove it. The money they found, Emily's diary. I never saw that money before Victoria produced it, and I found Emily's diary hidden in her sewing room just as I told the court. Someone wanted me to find it, James. Someone wanted me to appear connected to your family in ways that couldn't be explained." James studied her face in the lamplight, searching for deception and finding only the honest pain of a woman facing death for crimes she didn't commit. "If you're innocent, then someone else wanted you gone badly enough to frame you for attempted murder. Who would go to such lengths?" Margaret wanted to voice her suspicions about Victoria, but without proof it would sound like the desperate accusation of a condemned woman. "I don't know," she said instead, "but promise me you'll watch your children carefully. Promise me you won't trust anyone completely, not even family." As James left the jail that night, Margaret whispered a prayer to whatever force had guided her to the Morrison Ranch in the first place. If she truly had been sent to protect those children, then her death would leave them vulnerable to the very evil she had been meant to guard against. The gallows waited in the town square, constructed specifically for her execution. Margaret faced the dawn of her final day, knowing that justice had failed completely, that truth had been buried beneath carefully constructed lies, and that the children she loved as her own would never know how desperately she had wanted to save them. But in the growing light of that gray November morning, shadows moved in unexpected places, and secrets that had been buried for years began to claw their way toward the surface. Margaret's story was far from over, though she had no way of knowing that salvation would come from the most unlikely source imaginable. The revelation came at dawn on the day of Margaret's execution, delivered by the most unlikely messenger imaginable, Dr. Benjamin Coda's 10-year-old son, Timothy, who had been playing in the Morrison barn loft when he overheard a conversation that would change everything. Timothy burst into the jail just as Sheriff Takota was preparing to escort Margaret to the gallows, his small face flushed with excitement and terror. "Sheriff, you have to stop the hanging. I heard Miss Victoria talking to someone in the barn. She said she was going to get rid of the children next." Sheriff Takota knelt before the breathless boy. "Slow down, Timothy. What exactly did you hear? I was looking for kittens in the hayloft when Miss Victoria came in with a man I didn't recognize. She said now that the witch woman was gone, she could proceed with the final phase of her plan. She said the children were worth more dead than alive because of some insurance policy. Margaret's blood turned to ice as the implications hit her. Life insurance, she whispered. Victoria took out policies on the children. Sheriff Takoda's face darkened with understanding. Timothy, are you absolutely certain about what you heard? The boy nodded vigorously. She said she'd already tested the poison on them once to make sure it worked, and that this time she'd use enough to kill them all. She said people would think they died of grief over losing Miss Margaret. As Timothy spoke, Margaret's mind raced through the events of the past months with horrifying clarity. Victoria's sudden interest in the children's welfare, her knowledge of their daily routines, her access to the ranch during Margaret's imprisonment, it all painted a picture of calculated evil that made Margaret's supposed crimes pale in comparison. But Timothy's revelation was only the beginning, Doctor. Koda arrived within minutes of his son's breathless testimony, carrying a leather satchel and wearing an expression of grim determination. Sheriff, Dr. Koda announced, I've discovered something that changes everything about this case. Last night my wife was cleaning out her late mother's effects when she found a bundle of letters hidden in an old trunk. Letters that prove Margaret Ayana's true identity. Margaret felt her world tilt as Dr. Koda opened the satchel and withdrew a stack of yellowed correspondence. These are letters between Emily Morrison and her sister Margaret, letters spanning 15 years, ending only months before Emily's death. Sister? Sheriff Takoda stared at the documents in disbelief. Margaret Ayana is Emily Morrison's younger sister, Dr. Koda confirmed. Born Margaret Emily Johnson, she married Samuel Ayana and moved to Denver. When Samuel and their daughter died in that train accident, she was too grief-stricken to contact her family immediately. By the time she recovered enough to travel to Colorado, Emily had already died. Margaret's hands trembled as memories flooded back. Memories she had suppressed in her grief-addled state following the accident. Emily Morrison, her beloved older sister who had practically raised her after their parents died. Emily, who had written faithfully for years, sharing stories of her children and husband, describing the Colorado ranch in such vivid detail that Margaret felt she knew every room, every corner, every hiding place. The diary, Margaret whispered, understanding flooding through her. Emily wrote about me in her diary because she was hoping I would come. She described me to her children in her letters. That's why they felt so familiar to me. Emily had told them stories about their Aunt Margaret for years. Dr. Koda nodded gravely. According to these letters, Emily suspected Victoria of having unnatural interest in the children's welfare. She wrote about Victoria's frequent questions about life insurance policies and inheritance laws. Emily even expressed concern that Victoria might try to harm the family if James ever remarried. Sheriff Takoda's face had gone pale as the full scope of Victoria's deception became clear. She knew Margaret's true identity from the beginning. She let an innocent woman be condemned to death to cover her own crimes. Worse than that, Dr. Koda continued. I've been investigating the circumstances of Emily's death more thoroughly. The symptoms she displayed in her final weeks, gradual weakness, stomach ailments, periods of confusion, they're consistent with slow arsenic poisoning. The revelation hit everyone like a physical blow. Victoria Morrison hadn't just framed Margaret for attempted murder, she had actually murdered her own sister-in-law and would have been content to let Margaret die for the crime. We have to stop this execution immediately, Sheriff Takoda declared. But as he spoke, the church bells began to toll 9 o'clock, the appointed time for Margaret's hanging. In the distance they could hear the crowd gathering in the town square, eager to witness frontier justice. There's more, Dr. Koda said urgently. According to Emily's letters, she left a sealed document with Judge Morrison, Samuel's father, who died last spring. The document supposedly contained important information about the children's inheritance and guardianship arrangements. Sheriff Dakota's eyes widened. Judge Morrison's personal effects are stored in the courthouse basement. If Emily left instructions about the children's care, they raced through the courthouse corridors as the crowd outside grew restless. Margaret, still in shackles, stumbled along behind them, her heart pounding with hope and terror. In the basement storage room, they found Judge Morrison's legal files in a dusty wooden chest. The sealed envelope bore Emily's handwriting, "To be opened only in the event of my death and any threat to my children's welfare." Inside, they found a document that would forever change the Morrison family's fate. Emily's letter revealed the full extent of Victoria's manipulations. She had discovered that Victoria had been slowly poisoning her with arsenic obtained from the rat poison used in the bank's basement. Emily had hidden samples of her hair and fingernails, along with detailed documentation of her symptoms and Victoria's access to her food and drink, but the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Emily's will, properly witnessed and notarized, left the Morrison ranch and all family assets not to James, but to Margaret Ayanna, her sister, with the provision that she would care for the children and share the inheritance with James if he proved worthy of her trust. "She knew," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Emily knew Victoria was killing her, and she knew I would eventually come looking for her. She planned for all of this." The final piece of Emily's plan was a detailed confession naming Victoria as her murderer and outlining Victoria's schemes to gain control of the Morrison fortune through the children's life insurance policies. Emily had discovered that Victoria had secretly taken out substantial policies on all 6 children, naming herself as the beneficiary. Sheriff Dakota's hands shook as he read Emily's final words. "If anything happens to my children, look to Victoria first. She has never forgiven James for choosing me over her affections, and she sees my children as obstacles to her claim on our family's wealth. I pray that Margaret will arrive in time to protect them as she has always protected me." The truth was devastating in its completeness. Victoria Morrison had murdered her sister-in-law out of jealous rage and greed, then attempted to frame Margaret for crimes she herself had committed. She had orchestrated Margaret's arrival through carefully planted information about the ranch's need for a caregiver, intending to use her as a scapegoat for the children's eventual murders. As they rushed back upstairs with the evidence, they could hear the crowd outside growing impatient. The executioner was preparing the gallows, and townspeople were demanding to know why the proceedings were delayed. Sheriff Dakota burst through the courthouse doors with Margaret still in shackles, Dr. Coda close behind with Emily's documents. "Stop!" he shouted to the crowd. "This woman is innocent! We have proof of the real murderer's identity!" The crowd's bloodthirsty mood shifted to confusion and then anger as the truth was revealed. Victoria Morrison, who had positioned herself prominently near the gallows to witness Margaret's death, tried to slip away through the crowd, but several townsmen blocked her path. "Victoria Morrison," Sheriff Dakota announced in a voice that carried across the entire square, "you are under arrest for the murder of Emily Morrison and the attempted murder of Margaret Ayanna and the Morrison children." Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. Faced with undeniable evidence of her crimes and the hostile stares of people who had once respected her, she broke down with spectacular fury. "She deserved to die," Victoria screamed, her carefully constructed facade of grieving relative dissolving into murderous rage. "Emily stole everything that should have been mine. James should have chosen me, not some weak little fool who couldn't even bear healthy children. I gave Emily exactly what she deserved, and I would have given those brats the same if this interfering witch hadn't ruined everything." Her confession, delivered in front of dozens of witnesses, sealed her fate completely. As the crowd turned its anger toward the real villain, Margaret sank to her knees in the courthouse steps, overwhelmed by the realization that her nightmare was finally over. James pushed through the crowd and knelt beside her, his face wet with tears of relief and regret. "Margaret," he whispered, "I'm so sorry. I should have trusted you. I should have seen through Victoria's lies." Margaret looked into his eyes and saw the man she had fallen in love with, freed from the doubt and suspicion that had torn them apart. "You were protecting your children," she said softly. "You couldn't have known the truth was so much worse than you imagined." As Sheriff Dakota removed Margaret's shackles and placed them on Victoria's wrists instead, the crowd began to disperse with the strange mixture of satisfaction and unease that comes from witnessing justice finally served. The woman they had been prepared to watch hang was revealed as an innocent victim, while the real monster had hidden among them all along, wearing the mask of respectability and concern. Margaret Ayana was free, but more than that, she was home. Emily's final gift had given her not just exoneration, but a family, a fortune, and the knowledge that her sister's love had reached beyond the grave to protect them both. 1 year later, the Morrison Ranch bloomed with a vitality that seemed to emanate from every weathered board and sun-warmed stone. Margaret stood on the front porch in her ivory wedding dress, a simple but elegant gown that Elizabeth had helped her choose from the finest shop in Denver, watching as the children put finishing touches on the decorations for what would be the most joyous celebration Cedar Ridge had witnessed in years. The transformation of both the ranch and the family had been nothing short of miraculous. With Emily's inheritance rightfully restored and Victoria's schemes exposed, the mortgage had been paid in full, and improvements that James had only dreamed of were now reality. New barns housed healthy livestock, freshly painted fences, enclosed green pastures, and the house itself had been expanded to accommodate the growing family's needs. But the most profound changes were in the children themselves. Elizabeth, now 15, had blossomed into a confident young woman who helped Margaret manage the household with quiet competence. William, 13, had found his voice again and spent his days working alongside James, learning the ranch business with enthusiasm that filled his father's heart with pride. Caroline, 11, channeled her rebellious energy into training horses with a natural talent that amazed everyone. Thomas, 9, had grown strong and healthy, his mysterious ailments disappearing entirely once Victoria's poisonous influence was removed from their lives. 6-year-old Sarah had appointed herself Margaret's chief assistant in all wedding preparations, and 3-year-old Rose, now 4, followed her everywhere, chattering constantly about her Mama Margaret, with the absolute certainty of a child who had never known a moment's doubt about where she belonged. The truth about Margaret's identity had transformed the children's affection from desperate attachment to something deeper and more secure. She wasn't just the woman who had saved them, she was their mother's sister, their blood relative who had been meant to find them all along. Emily's letters, which Margaret had read to them over many evenings by the fireplace, painted a picture of sisterly love that explained the inexplicable connection they had all felt from the beginning. "You have Emily's eyes," James had told Margaret the night after her exoneration, when they sat together on the porch where they had first fallen in love. "That's why the children trusted you so quickly. That's why I felt like I'd known you forever." Victoria Morrison's trial had been swift and merciless. Faced with overwhelming evidence of her crimes and the testimony of her own confession, she had been sentenced to life imprisonment. The revelation of her years-long poisoning of Emily had shocked even the hardened frontier community, and her attempts to murder 6 innocent children for insurance money had sealed her fate as one of the most reviled criminals in Colorado's history. Dr. Coda's thorough investigation had revealed the full scope of Victoria's manipulations. She had orchestrated Margaret's arrival at the ranch by ensuring that information about James's need for a caregiver reached the Denver employment agencies where desperate widows sought work. She had planted Emily's diary where Margaret would find it, intending to use Margaret's emotional connection to the children as evidence of unnatural manipulation. She had even arranged for the money to be discovered in Margaret's room, having stolen it from the bank's emergency funds. Most chillingly, Dr. Coda had found detailed plans in Victoria's private papers outlining exactly how she intended to kill the children after Margaret's execution. The life insurance policies she had secretly purchased would have made her wealthy beyond imagination, while the community's sympathy for the tragic deaths would have ensured that no one questioned her claims of overwhelming grief. Now, as Margaret adjusted her veil and prepared to walk down the aisle that the children had created between rows of chairs borrowed from the church, she marveled at how completely their nightmare had transformed into a dream come true. Judge Takoda, who had presided over her near execution, would now officiate at her wedding with tears of joy rather than grim duty. James appeared at her side, resplendent in his new black suit, his weathered face glowing with happiness that made him look years younger. "Are you ready to make this official, Mrs. Soon-to-be Morrison?" Margaret smiled, thinking of Emily's letters and her sister's hopes for this exact moment. "I've been ready since the day I arrived, James. I just didn't know it yet." The ceremony was simple but perfect. The entire population of Cedar Ridge attended, eager to celebrate the union of two people whose love had survived the ultimate test. Sheriff Takoda, now a close family friend, gave Margaret away in the absence of any other relatives. Dr. Coda and his wife served as witnesses, their son Timothy beaming with pride at his role in uncovering the truth that had saved Margaret's life. When Judge Takoda pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that rose from the assembled crowd could be heard for miles across the Colorado plains. James kissed his bride as their 6 children, now officially Margaret's children through marriage and blood, surrounded them with embraces and tears of pure joy. "Do you, Margaret Morrison, promise to love and protect these children as your own for all the days of your life?" Judge Takoda asked in an impromptu addition to the ceremony. "I do," Margaret replied, her voice carrying clearly across the gathering. "I promise to love them, guide them, and keep them safe, just as their mother would have wanted." Rose tugged at Margaret's dress and announced loudly, "Now you're really our mama." The crowd erupted in laughter and applause. As the sun set over the ranch that evening, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the new Morrison family gathered on the porch for their first official dinner together. The table groaned under the weight of food prepared by the women of Cedar Ridge as their contribution to the celebration, and the house rang with laughter and conversation. Margaret looked around the table at the faces that had become her whole world. James, her husband and partner in rebuilding their lives. Elizabeth, already planning her own future with the confidence of a young woman who knew she was loved. William describing his dreams of expanding the ranch. Caroline bubbling with stories about her latest horse training adventures. Thomas, healthy and happy and full of boyish enthusiasm. Sarah chattering about her plans for the garden. And little Rose falling asleep in Margaret's lap as the evening wound down. "What are you thinking about?" James asked softly, noticing her contemplative expression. Margaret smiled, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the locket she now wore, Emily's locket, returned to her by the court, along with all the other evidence of Victoria's crimes. Inside was a photograph of Emily with baby Rose, but Margaret had added a new picture of all 6 children taken just after the wedding. "I'm thinking about Emily," she replied, "about how she loved us enough to plan for this moment even while she was dying, about how love really doesn't end with death. It just finds new ways to protect the people we care about." James took her hand and squeezed it gently. "She brought us together, didn't she? Even from beyond the grave, Emily made sure her children would be safe and loved. As the stars appeared in the vast Colorado sky, Margaret Morrison, sister, wife, and mother, held her sleeping daughter close and whispered a prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought her home to the family she was always meant to find. The Morrison Ranch was whole again, filled with laughter and love and the promise of countless happy tomorrows. Sometimes life's greatest blessings come disguised as our deepest trials. Margaret's story reminds us that when we think we've lost everything, our spouse, our children, our purpose, God may be preparing us for a love we never imagined possible. At 35, Margaret thought her chance at motherhood and marriage had died with her family. But Emily's 6 children were waiting for the mother their hearts recognized before their minds understood why. How many of us have felt that pull toward certain people, that inexplicable sense of coming home when we meet them? Margaret's supernatural intuition wasn't magic. It was the fierce love of a woman whose maternal heart refused to be silenced by grief. Her story teaches us that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about choosing to love completely, even when the world doesn't understand. The children didn't need Margaret to replace their mother. They needed her to honor Emily's memory by becoming the mother Emily always intended her to be. In our golden years, when we wonder if our best days are behind us, Margaret's journey proves that our greatest love story might still be waiting just around the corner. What moment in your life felt like coming home to people you'd never met before? Have you ever experienced that unexplainable maternal or paternal pull toward someone else's children? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear about your own unexpected family connections.